All right, welcome back, everyone. So we just saw a breakdown of Eliza and we saw a breakdown of Alice, and then we broke out to our rooms to kind of learn a little bit about natural language processing, what exactly it is, how does it work in the background, and read a little bit about the history of AI itself. Now let's talk about generative chatbots. This is the nitty gritty stuff, what everybody likes to see, right? We all are already somewhat familiarized with chatbots. Now, currently, we could go over to ChatGPT and try to interact with this interface, and it would work fantastically. But we are now programmers, and something that may be important to us is to learn how exactly we can maybe implement into our applications an interface with GPT, right? Well, now that I learned about servers and I know about requests and I can stand up a Flash server, well, I could probably create an API endpoint that would attach to a function that would send a request over to OpenAI. Well, we've seen how to interact with third-party APIs through JavaScript. And just to clarify this, let me go ahead and demonstrate here. So I'll go ahead and show this over in the Buffalo Questions channel. So ChatGPT actually has an API that you can utilize to interact with it, just like the Poke API does. All right, I can come over to the Poke API. The Poke API has endpoints and documentation that I can read through to ensure that I'm actually interacting with it the correct way. Click on check out the docs, and it takes me over to documentation. Well, OpenAI has the same thing. It has documentation as to how I can actually employ with it and how I can interact with it. And it's actually a lot easier to interact with than the majority of APIs because it provides for us a class that we can utilize. And then it gives us an example over how to do it inside of JavaScript. Well, let's start reading a little bit about how we can implement this. Well, as we read into this, it tells me, hey, you're going to need an API key. So you need to generate an API key. I'm not going to go over the process of generating an key here for the classroom. I already have an API key. But if you are interested in this is something you want to implement into one of your projects, you would simply click on the create an API key button and then go through the process of creating an API key. Now, when that API key is returned, you're going to want to copy it and paste it into some sort of file that will never get pushed into GitHub or that you don't want to be shared. In this case, we'll utilize a .env file. And we'll name it as such, just like it tells me to name it. It tells me, hey, you want to name this as open API key, and then you want to set it to the value of the actual API key it provides you. Now, this is going to help us with authentication when it comes to the API key values. So it's super important that you actually set it into your .env file. This example code that is showing us down here, where it's saying to export information, it's actually giving you a terminal command that you can use inside of your terminal to set this environment variable inside of the environment of where your terminal is currently running at. So your current bash script that would be being executed while this terminal exists would hold this environment variable. Doesn't really help with consistency, so it's better to actually place it in a file called .env file. All right. And then it gives me a couple of options. It says, hey, this is how you want to install information. And notice that it even tells me there's a couple of different ways that I can interact with this. I can interact with this with JavaScript, .NET, or Python. And here it tells me how I can bring in Python as a general rule of thumb to actually be able to create text. All right. It gives me some information for analyzing images in case I want to work with images. And it gives me more information about how to interact with a tool, information about how to treat things like a stream in case I want to have a conversation. But for the simplicity of today's lecture, we're going to keep it as simple as I want to send a series of text. I want to receive a response. Well, let's go through the process here. First, I have to install OpenAI. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this. Pip install OpenAI. In my case, it's going to tell me that the requirements are already satisfied because I have already installed this in the past. And this part isn't here in the documentation, but I want to install python-env. And that will allow me to load environment variables. So I'm going to go to python.env. You can read through the documentation, but here's what I want to do. I want to pip install python.env. All right, great. So now I have my .env. This is going to allow me to load my environment variables and be able to reference them throughout my script. Okay, well, in the documentation, I saw that there was an export file or that there was an export command for loading my OpenAPI key. So I need to make sure that's actually loaded into my environment and that I can view it. Well, how do I do that? I'm going to go ahead and say from .env, I want to import load.env. And that's going to allow me to actually pull in all of my .env variables from a specific file. It's asking me for a file path. Well, in with this directory, I want to load the file named .env. Great. That's going to give me my OpenAPI key. Well, now I can just simply print, and I want to make sure I import OS so I can ensure that this exists. I'm going to say os.environ.get, pass in OpenAI API key, and then state missing API key if it's not there. Okay, so let's execute this. I'm going to run Python main.py, and you can see that my API key actually gets returned in the terminal. All right. Covered quite a bit of things so far. Let me go ahead and do a quick recap before we continue pushing forward. I want to interact with OpenAI. In order to do so, I need to ensure that I have an API key. So I simply went through the process of clicking on create an API key. That would give me the API key itself. Instead of setting it within my current terminal, I want to have it some way where that key can persist. So I placed it inside of a .env file. This .env file, notice there's no space after the equal sign. That is very important. Make sure there's no spaces in between that equal sign and assignment, because this is being read or executed within Bash. So spaces and other syntactical stuff is very, very different than what we've seen inside of JavaScript and Python. So ensure there's no spaces after the equal sign, that you utilize a single character to mark a string, and your API key has to be named Open API key, just like it is here on the left-hand side. All right, now to use it within our Python script, we have to import OS, which we've seen before when we were referencing file paths. And we have to actually install this .env format. Now, .env is specifically so that we can load all variables inside of Python. We utilize this load.env function, specify the path to find this .env file, and then we're simply just ensuring that this key exists within the scope of this script. All right. Now that's quite a bit to cover there. So I just want to pause here and make sure that there aren't any questions. Does anyone have any questions over how we saved our .env file, how we saved our API key, and how we're now loading it into our Python script? Let's hear it, Tony.
So doing the .env, is that just a more secure way? Like, is it less secure to just run it through the terminal, or you just advise this for the program in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. When it comes to security, I'll cover security towards the end of the class. And if I don't, please remind me to do so I can make sure that that gets addressed before we dismiss the class. Um, but it doesn't really change anything whether I run it within the terminal or place it within a .env file in security aspects. What changes is how long that token will be stored for and where it's being stored in memory. Right? I don't want to store it within some sort of text file or anywhere outside the scope of this project. And I know that it has to load with the environment. So common practice in software engineering practices is to store it within a .env file. All right, this .env file will have all of my environment variables for a project, and they will all be loaded when this function is executed. Now, why not just put it inside of the terminal? Well, the moment I do this and I crash the terminal, and then I load a new terminal to come into live, you'll see that my old terminal is here. Let me go ahead and crash it. Now it doesn't exist. My terminal would no longer know about it. And every single time I have to execute it, I would need to go and recreate a new key or reference the key to bring it back to my terminal. Does that answer your question, Tony? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. All right, Tom.
Yeah, for importing the OS, I understand that it's for getting the file path, but are we only doing that for the error handling, so to speak, for that print open API key, missing API key, as opposed to using it for like the load dot env for getting the actual file path for the dot env file?
Awesome. So that's also a good question. So OS isn't just something that defines paths. It's something that defines your entire operating system. So currently, when this script is being executed, OS gives us access to everything that's happening inside of my machine. I could interact with files, directories, write new files, interact with new stuff by just utilizing OS. If I wanted to write a script that would grab all YouTube videos and then upload them, I would still utilize OS, right? Now, what we've seen it before in the past is to actually grab paths. In this case, what we're interacting with is the current environment that's loaded inside of the operating system, right? So this loads that .env into the environment. And now to grab that variable, I have to go into the operating system inside of its environment and then get the OpenAI key. So those are the two functions there. It does help me with error handling, but in reality, environ is just introduced as a dictionary. And this .get method would be, hey, if this key doesn't exist, then return this. Does that answer your question, Tom? All right, awesome. I see head nods. Okay, perfect. Since there aren't any other questions, let's go ahead and continue pushing forward and actually write some code. Well, now I have my OpenAI. My OpenAI key is created. Here's my Pythonic example. And here it shows me how to utilize it with test. Again, I would make sure, I'm pretty sure I already have it, but I'm just gonna do it again. I go to pip install OpenAI. It has been installed. Well, now I can import from OpenAI. I can say from OpenAI, and I apologize. Let me bring back that print statement because I don't want to. There you go. From OpenAI, I want to import OpenAI. Now we've seen this kind of text before, or these practices before in Python. Is this a variable, a function, or a class that I'm looking at?
Class?
Yeah, I'm actually interacting with a class now. I am importing the class of OpenAI from OpenAI. Well, what does that mean? That means that if I want to utilize it, I have to actually create an instance of OpenAI. So client is equal to OpenAI. And so this creates an instance of OpenAI. Loads .env file variables to current environment, confirms environment variable exists. All right. So now I created an instance of OpenAI, and I could actually go through the process of writing some information and interacting with OpenAI. Well, in this case, it's recommending that I utilize GPT-5, which, yes, it is a good model, but because we're just going to be interacting with text and I want to stick to more of a cheaper version of OpenAI, I'm going to go ahead and utilize GPT-4.0 Mini. Now, if you want to take a look at the different models that they have, pretty sure there is a place here. that goes over the different models that they have. I probably have to open this up. Let me see here. There you go. So here we have different models. You could break these down to take a look at what they have available for you and which model would best fit your intent. But in our case, because I've already practiced this in the past, I know that GPT-4 would actually do the accomplish the function that we want. So now we want to the query function that will interact with OpenAI. We want to establish the model we will leverage within OpenAI. And we want to pass the prompt for OpenAI to process. And then finally, we'll go ahead and display the response. All right. So let's declare a function. Let's say talk to AI. We'll go ahead and pass in a response, or excuse me, a prompt, which we know we want it to be a string. And this will actually return a string as well. All right, now I want to establish what kind of model I want to utilize. Well, first I want to interact with OpenAI. So I'm going to go ahead and do response is equal to excuse me, this is going to be equal to client dot chat dot completions dot create. You'll see my code looks a little bit different than what's being specified here. We could just run with this here of what they have in the right-hand side to take a look at it. Let's do client. Dot response dot create. And now we can establish what kind of model we want to interact with. Well, now I could say the model that I want to interact with. And notice that it's already giving me some suggestions there. Well, I do want to utilize ChatGPT 4.0, but instead of latest, I want to utilize mini. Okay. Now I can pass in the prompt that I want to interact with it. So I can say input, make that equal to, and pass in the prompt. Finally, we can return response.output text. All right. Let me go ahead and do a little bit of indentation here. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this function here. I'm going to call a print statement, and I'm just simply going to call the talk to AI function that takes in some string. Well, let's say my string is write a function that says hello world. And let's execute our script. Okay, so it tried to execute my script. It seems like it ran into some issues here. Error param model. Let's see, error code for 100 error message. The request model ChatGPT 4.0 mini does not exist. Type invalid request. All right, and that is because it is GPT 4.0 mini. We send it again. And there it is. There is my response. So here it's stating my key. That's happening because I told it to ensure that my key is within my environment. I initialize the class, more than likely somewhere inside of this class constructor or my initializer of this class. There's a portion that grabs my key. Let's see. Here we go. So API key is equal to none. Let's see if we can find where that API key. Here we go. So we can see if API key is none, it's going to interact with the OS environment and get open API, right? So we can see that within the initializer. So when I initiate the class, it grabs my API key. I make my function, which takes in a string and returns a string. I make a response, which utilizes this open API. And I say responses.create, meaning I want you to generate a response for me. I then specify the model that I'm trying to interact with, which in this case is GPT-4o mini, and I give it the prompt that I pass into the function. Finally, I return my response output text. So when I print, all it's returning is the response from the GPT-4 model. So the GPT-4 model tells me, certainly, here's a simple function in Python that prints hello world. def hello world, print hello world. And then it tells me call the function as such. If you're interested in a different programming language, just let me know. All right. So that's how we can interact with GPT-4 through programming. Does anyone have any questions over how we were able to interact with OpenAI through a Python script? Let's hear it, Tom.
So I saw that you commented out our print statement up there, the os.environ, and that was because it was part of the OpenAI classes in it. Um, that would still require us to import OS for that to operate correctly, though, right?
No, because if we go into OpenAI, this imports OS itself. So we don't need to
Got
actually import it ourselves. I mainly did this portion here, specifically just so that we ourselves can ensure that it's within our script. All right. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. So now let me just bring in the full circle here because I want to make sure that this makes sense when we're developing applications. We have our front end. I'm sure we're probably tired of seeing this at this point, but we have our front end, which interacts with our back end. And then we have our database, which sometimes requests may or may not interact with it. Well, a front end would interact with the back end, may or may not interact with a database to grab data. Oh, that is not what I meant to click on. Hopefully it doesn't open. And then return a response back to the user, right? Well, in this case, the front end would send a request, maybe stating, write a function to the backend. The backend would then send a request to OpenAI. That response would come back from OpenAI to our Flask backend, and then our Flask would return it to a front end, stating AI response. So hopefully this help ties in the dots here. Right, we're not going to go through the whole process of standing up a Flash server and doing an HTML form, but we will in future lectures see how this entire process interacts later on. All right. Well, now that we know how to interact with API, or excuse me, with AI programmatically to an actual API endpoint, let's start talking about how we should be utilizing AI from a student perspective, right? Because it's great to know how to utilize it from the application perspective. It's great to learn everything that we did about chatbots. But for us as students, how can AI benefit me? Now, there's two topics that I want to cover here. One of them being prompt engineering, and the other one being learning with AI. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on learning with AI because we here in Code Platoon would advise all of you to not utilize prompt engineering to create working projects, especially not as of now. It's a good tool to have later on once you're confident in all of your fundamentals and everything that you're learning here in the classroom. But for now, it is very important that we actually write everything out, key by key, to ensure we're actually achieving that mastery. All right. So let's go through the process. How is AI useful for me? Well, I want to learn utilizing AI. I want to understand what exactly it is that I'm learning, concepts that I have. Maybe I have extra questions that I require more information for. So I'm going to go ahead and backtrack all the way to OOP week, which just happened 2 modules ago, right? Now in OOP, we learned about the 5 principles of, or the 5 pillars of OOP, and we learned how to write object-oriented programming scripts with Python. But we didn't really cover how to do it with JavaScript. So now I could go through the process of doing research inside of Google, et cetera, et cetera. But what if I want to do it in a more expedient way? I want to learn how this information works and do it through Python. Well, I could ask questions like this. Well, let's say I just say, um, how do I write OOP in JavaScript? And let's see what kind of information comes back when I ask this to this model. Okay, so it tells me, great question. Writing object-oriented programming OOP in JavaScript can look a little bit different than traditional class-based languages like Java or C++, but the concepts are the same. Okay, let's break it down. So it tells me JavaScript OOP foundations. JavaScript is prototype-based language before ES6. Well, there's one question. What does that mean, right? Prototype-based language. No idea what that means. Before ES6, OOP was done using constructor functions and prototypes. Okay, so that's before ES6. But now that ES6 has come, what does that mean? So ES6 introduced classes, which are syntactic sugar over prototypes. Okay, you can use either approach. Modern JavaScript prefers ES6 classes. Okay, so using it, here you can see that there's class, there's a constructor, it specifies this dot name, it establishes a method, and then it even shows me a portion of how to make an instance of this class. And then it goes into inheritance and encapsulation. Now, it's giving me quite a bit of information. It's giving me a very high level of overview over everything that we learned. But I can try to make my prompts a little bit more specific to have more value. All right, let's go ahead and do, let me see if I could regress this. So I'm going to delete this chat. Okay, here we are in a new chat. So I currently know how to write OOP in Python. And I'm now interested in applying these fundamentals in a language like JavaScript. I know the concepts in high level are the same, but it is important for me to learn the granular differences in how the languages work and how syntax differences are referenced. To start off, and I would actually break this up, to start off, Can you explain how a class is declared within JavaScript and how a, let's do init method would be translated within JavaScript? Please ensure to explain things like memory locations and how memory is distributed and different syntax like self versus this. Okay. Now, there's a significant difference between my very first prompt and my second prompt that I'm writing now. Can anybody tell me some highlights as to why this prompt has changed or how we would expect a different output from this prompt than from the first one? Let's hear it, Bryson.
Yeah, before you're just like explain this concept to me, and now you're telling it what you know and asking it for specific information so it can scrape through the internet and find exactly what you're looking for.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm not just asking a very vague question. I'm actually giving it a starting point, and I'm asking it a very direct question as well. If we remember back to our Beyond Tech talk in regards to feedback, when we talked about how to give feedback, we were giving actionable things and we were being descriptive as possible. Well, just like we give feedback to our peers, we also want to give AI that kind of feedback, right? We want to tell AI, hey, this is my background. This is where I'm currently at. This is the information that I know. And these are exactly the topics that I want you to focus in. If you do not provide it a left and right lateral limit, I'm a motorman, so I use the lateral limit information a lot. So please let me know if that doesn't make sense to anybody. If you don't provide a left and right lateral limit to to these tools, they're just gonna run. They're just gonna run away with whatever they can to try to give you as much information, right? Their purpose is to satisfy your needs. If you give them a vague question, they're going to give you a vague response in hopes that it can give you the high level overview for you to just say, oh, okay, this is good enough. I can keep moving with this. Now, within this prompt itself, notice how I try to pay attention a lot to my spelling. Why would spelling matter when I'm interacting with an AI agent? All right. Go ahead, Tony.
Because it still uses keywords, so it's still having to match keywords in the library.
Yeah, it's still trying to identify different keywords, and it's also going through my entire text to try to clarify intent, right? In that article that we just learned about natural language processing, it's parsing through all of my texts to ensure that it can actually accomplish the task that I'm asking for. All right. Now, I left a couple of indentations and some spaces. What could that do for the language model? What would be the purpose between separating these paragraphs and also utilizing ticks like backticks to signify the highlight of information? What could that do for the agent? Let's hear it, Tony.
Uh, my assumption would be that it would separate it into separate priorities. So stating, I'm going to explain this first, I'll explain this next, and then the ticks would be for emphasis. So I really want you to touch on this. I really want you to touch on this, that kind of thing.
Nice, awesome. Yeah, that pretty much breaks it down exactly how it works in the background, right? It would be able to separate the intent of both of those statements. It would still signify it as one independent prompt, but it would be able to, hey, this is the intent of this first paragraph is to give me a starting point, while the intent of the second paragraph is for me to execute. right? So one of them is for reference, the other one is for execution. Then the backticks are just simply, this isn't just text. This isn't, don't try to analyze init as a regular word. Understand that this is likely code that I'm passing to you, right? Because just like we know, backticks usually signify I'm about to put in some sort of code. If I would utilize something like triple quotes, it would just say, oh, this is an important part of text. But typically, when you're trying to signify code, it's identified by this backtick, or if you want to pass in code blocks, passing code blocks within triple things. That's the best way that I would be able to analyze that it is code. Now, without those parsers, without putting triple ticks or a single tick, it might still be able to identify, oh, this is code just by recognizing the text patterns. But you want to help out the agent in the fact that it's not overworking. It's still a machine. So every time it's executing a task for you, it already has a certain number, a space of performance that it can dedicate to accomplish its task for you, right? If you're a paying customer, you probably have a higher performance space than the average user. But if you're on their free trial and you're just interacting with their general chatbot, you don't want to utilize that performance in, I guess, ineffective or inappropriate ways. You want to make sure that you help the chatbot utilize its performance to actually give you information, not try to read your text. So the easier you make the text parsing aspect for it, the more interactions you'll be able to have with the machine and the more useful information that that machine will be able to provide for you. All right. So now let's say I send this request. Notice how it's actually thinking now. It took a while to think that time instead of just giving me a direct response. Okay, so now it's telling me this is exactly the right mindset when transitioning OOP skills from Python to JavaScript. While both languages support OOP, they differ fundamentally in how they handle memory, inheritance, and object behavior. Awesome. So let's walk through it clear step by step. So class declaration. A class declaration in Python might look as such. Here we have an init method, and we have a method itself called speak. All right, in JavaScript, notice how it's referencing this class of dog. As you all know, that's very common in our curriculum. Excuse me. So because I'm signed in, I know who I am, it's giving me this reference to the class of dog, right? With you guys, if you were to run the same exact prompt and you've never interacted with it before, it might give you something completely different than dog itself. All right, so in JavaScript, the equivalent would look like this. So class dog, constructor name, and comes in with this.name. All right, so key differences at glance. So class keyword, so here's class dog. All right, constructor, which is the init method, and instead it actually has a constructor on the right-hand side. Notice that self is not being passed into the constructor. The instance reference, where before self was in reference to the instance itself, now it's this in reference to the instance itself. String interpolation is a little bit different, and then obviously the indentation blocks. All right, so the constructor here breaks it down, the init versus the constructor. In Python, init runs after the object is allocated in memory, self refers to the instance, and memory allocation is handled by Python's internal C layer before init executes. Now, this last portion is actually very vital for me to understand. So runs after the object is allocated. Okay, in JavaScript, the constructor method serves the same role. It's automatically called when you use the new keyword. Okay, so this one has a trigger. The trigger for it is the new keyword. Whereas in Python, that didn't have a trigger, right? It was utilized every time I made the instance of the class. So I think that's important for me to ask. Does this mean that I can make an instance of the class without utilizing the constructor? All right, so now memory allocation occurs when new is used before constructor executes. Okay, so maybe I can't create an instance of the class because if memory allocation isn't utilized, then what am I doing if I don't pass in a new? Okay, so what happens internally? A new empty object is created in memory. The object's prototype is linked to doc.prototype. The constructor function is called with this bound to that new object. Okay, it breaks down memory and object model differences. So here in JavaScript, everything is either primitive or an object. Okay, so objects are a reference. So what it's telling me is that this class is actually just an object, but it's like a layer over it. And notice that it even breaks it down all the way to self versus this. So what it is must be passed, values depend on. It talks about the prototype chain, which versus Python inheritance. Okay, this is breaking down inheritance and a couple of other subjects that I didn't ask it to, which is okay. It's trying to keep me active. So it's giving me information for me to continue digging, right? It's saying, all right, well, just in case you're interested, here's how it works whenever we're talking about inheritance. But the content that has been returned to me is way more descriptive. I have learned a lot more, and it's also giving me more leading questions as to how does everything work whenever I establish a new class. This is a good, effective way to utilize AI. I want to ask it information to break down the skills that I have already learned. As you'll learn in your programming career, everything that we teach here, all the fundamentals that we teach here in Code Platoon, they relate to every single other language. The only difference between other frameworks and other languages, they're just a little bit angrier. They require some sort of different settings, but the concept of OOP never goes away. The concept of how a model view controller works inside of Django doesn't change as to how it works within a .NET framework. Everything that you're learning here in CodePlatoon can translate to all the other languages. They just require different syntax, and they might just operate a little bit different under the hood. And those differences that happen under the hood are things that you want to make sure you know and highlight. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we can write prompts that can effectively teach us new information and how we should be utilizing AI to learn new information? Go ahead, Tom.
Would you be able to give us a good example on how to properly iterate on this question?
Yeah,
Since
absolutely.
since we are always told, it's best done in an iterative fashion.
Of course. So now that I've learned this information, right, it's giving me all this. Well, specifically, there's this new portion that I saw that really kind of brought some questions to my attention. And I also want to ask about this memory and object model differences. Well, first, I would say this raises a couple of questions. And let me make this a little bigger that I would like to clarify. Okay, one, when you say the constructor is triggered by the new keyword, does that mean an instance of a class can be created within JavaScript without utilizing the constructor? And then two, if so, does the instance of the class only exist during runtime since memory isn't allotted? I'm spelling that wrong. Let's see. Okay. Unless the new keyword is utilized. Okay, so I could pass that in as some follow-on questions. So it tells me, excellent questions. You're thinking about how JavaScript actually allocates and references memory. Is the constructor always triggered new? Yes, the constructor method of a class is only called when you use new. Okay, so notice it didn't actually answer my question just yet. This triggers several. A new empty object is created. That new object's prototype. What happens if we call the class without new? If we try to call the class as a normal function, JavaScript throws an error. This is a safeguard built into modern JS. However, in older pre-ES6 JavaScript construction functions could be called either with or without new. Okay, so essentially a class cannot be created. It's clarifying that for me. Okay, so can you create an instance of a class without new? Not automatically via class syntax that you can manually simulate or bypass the constructor process in certain cases. Here are the possibilities. And that would break it down for me. All right, it's giving me quite a bit of information, but I do want to clarify what it's at. What we're saying to best utilize an iterative process for is for your prompt, not for the continuation of the conversation that you're having with GPT. So, for example, let's go ahead and do an example where we're actually trying to develop an application here. And when I want to develop this application, I'm actually going to do it through a text file. So here I'm just going to go and say touch prompt.txt. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up prompt.txt. And in here, I want to actually write my first prompt. So in this first prompt, let's say I want to create a Flask server that will have an API endpoint, or let's just say that will be capable of creating students and returning a student's list. Let's say this is all I want to pass in there. All right, so I pass it in. Now I start getting a response here. Okay, and we'll take a look at this response here shortly. I apologize to everyone, but I am going to need a quick 3-minute break. So currently right now it is 11:47. Let's come back at 11:50 and continue on with our lecture. Apologies, everybody. All right, welcome back, everyone. So currently I sent my first prompt. It says create a Flash server that will be capable of creating students and returning a student list. So here it walks me through the process of Flask. Notice how it didn't give me any installation process. So from Flask, import Flask request. All right, it makes an app. Okay, if we're not familiar with this, it's just passing in the file name as the name for the application. Here we have the students. We see the route there. Okay, awesome. So we see this create students portion, which grabs the data in JSON. If the data isn't there, it kills it. And we can see that students are being managed just as such. Okay, and it gives me a little bit of ways to try to test this application. Okay, this is a good first iteration, but definitely didn't accomplish all of my goals, right? I have a lot of stuff that's still missing. So if I want to do something that completely works, let's go through a second prompt. So in this prompt, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, currently, I do not, or actually, let's not worry about dependencies just yet. Let's say I'm going to take the very first prompt again and iterate through there. So create a Flash server that will be capable of creating students and returning a student list. So create a class server that will be capable of creating students or creating a student within a database and return a student list from all entries within a database. Let's go ahead and write that here. Let's change our prompt now. And let's send this request. Okay, so absolutely, let's create simple Flash server that uses SQLite for simplicity. Oh, well, I don't really like SQLite, but we'll keep going with this. We have SQL Alchemy that's being introduced, creating a student, returning a list of students. So here we have SQL Alchemy. It's trying to utilize SQLite. Okay. Track modifications. There's the student that's being created. It gives me a to-dict method to be able to serialize all of my data. With app contacts, it creates all, so it's gonna create this database actually. And then it gives me my create student function or API method where we have data.get that gets passed in. Okay, I can see that a new student is being created. We're making sure that the student doesn't already exist. Here we go, it's going into how to add the student into the session and commit it. And then it returns the student itself. Okay, and get students is pretty simple. It just queries the database, turns them all into dictionaries, and then runs. All right, so now let's continue on here. Let's go into our third. So we have create a Flask server that will interact with a PostgreSQL database with with PostgreSQL with a database named school. Please ensure to include PsychoPG within the URI configuration. This API should be capable of read and post, or excuse me, read and create actions for a table named student with the values of ID, name. Two API endpoints should be provided. And then I can stay one API slash v1 students, or excuse me, I should say one API endpoint. Where get should return all students. And then two, where post creates a student. All right, so here's a little bit of differences. I can send this prompt now towards GPT. And now when I send my request, let's see what kind of response comes back. Okay, it's taking a little bit more time to think. So now it has Flask, JSON, SQL. From SQL Alchemy, it's also grabbing in dialects for PostgreSQL. Nice. When it's specifying the database URI, it's specifying PostgreSQL and PsychoPG. Notice it's still just utilizing filler words for username and password. So there's something to annotate there that I can probably clarify. Okay, let's see what else we have. Here's the database schema, which passes into SQL Alchemy. The table name, which is student. ID and name. We should be familiarized with this integer and varchar by now. There's a toDictionary method that's still being provided. This is the portion that creates that table. Now here's my getStudents endpoint, which grabs all the students. And here's my createStudents endpoint. All right, so this is a lot more useful. And this is actually something that would probably run within my current environment, as long as this is all provided. But let's break this down one more time to take a look at it and make it as specific as possible. So here's my fourth prompt. So create a Flash server that will interact with a PostgreSQL that would interact with PostgreSQL. And now I want to change it up to where I can say database requirements. Okay, so database name requirements, so DB name, that would be set to school. We have my table, which would be set to student. Table values would be of ID, which is of serial, primary key, integer. And then we have our name, which could be a varchar of 100. All right, so now we can go ahead and do our Flask requirements. And our Flask requirement should have one API endpoint, and we could just copy this from down below. Okay. And now we can say, please ensure to include psychopg. Okay, let's extend this a little bit. Let's do db host will be localhost. db user will be Francisco Avila. db password would be NA or no password. And then the DB port, of course, which in this case would be 5432. All right, so there's our database requirements. Here's our Flask app requirements. I just want those two endpoints. PsychoPG within the database URI configuration. Let's do this part of connects with PostgreSQL through SQL Alchemy. Okay, PsychoPG, this API should be capable of reading, create actions for a table. ID and name. Okay, fantastic. So now this has a little bit more instructions. It breaks down everything as primitively as possible. And then I can say, please, or additionally, provide a bash script that will conduct the following. And actually, that's probably a little bit out of scope. Let's leave it at this. All right, we'll go ahead and pass this fourth prompt here. I'm going to go ahead and clarify this, pass this all in. Now I send my request. And let's see what this continues with. So here's my SQL Alchemy with PsychoPG as the driver with the requirements you specified, the server creating a new student. So from Flask, import Flask, we also already seen this. Not sure why it needs request, but that is okay. So here's the Flask. We start the Flask app. It specifies all of my variables to specify there is no password. Here's my configuration for the URI. So notice how it's just filling in, utilizing these values that I passed into it. Here's SQL Alchemy. We can see the integer. It's now specifying that it's a primary key as well. the app route for getting students, the app route for creating a student, and then finally the portion where it creates my table and is able to run it. And here it even gives me instructions. I never asked for instructions, but now it's giving me instructions. Okay. So pip install Flask, SQL Alchemy, and PyPG binary. Make sure PostgreSQL is running in the background with a database named school. In case you don't, it tells you how to do so. Execute Python app.py. And then you can see that get all students would actually return that information. And it gives you a command for being able to send a request through the terminal to that same application. All right, so if I wanted to test it out, I can do something like touch app.py. I can do create DB school. Okay, so it looks like it already exists. To make sure that that database actually exists, I can come over to the app, copy this information, paste it. Notice I'm not changing anything. I'm just copying and pasting information. I'm going to come down. I can utilize this piece of code here. So it looks like it gave me a wrong command with PsychoPG binary that needs to be wrapped inside of quotation marks. Okay, so now it's working. I have everything. I already have my database of school. And now it tells me, hey, just run the Python app. So I can just say Python app.py. So it's telling me it's missing Flask SQL Alchemy. Okay, so I can try that again. So pip install. And let's see where that install limit is. Let's do Flask SQL Alchemy. I'm pretty sure this is wrong in general, so I may have to do some research as to where this one comes from. Let's see. Pip install -u. So you can see some of the instructions that it's providing for me are wrong, and that is okay. I see a hand up from Arnold. Go ahead, Arnold. If you're speaking, you're muted somehow. I don't know if it's on your actual mic. You're still muted, Arnold. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and keep pushing, and then if you could, please just put it on the chat or try to figure out your mic. All right, so now everything is running. I can go
Arnold
ahead.
Arnold was saying that you misspelled alchemy.
Oh, well, that will do it. Thank you. All right, so now I can come over, check, make sure that this works. Let's see, my server is working inside of my local host, so I could utilize curl. Okay, we can see that no students are currently entered. I can use this to create a student. This is going to create a student named Alice. Okay, my response came back, which shows me Alice. And now if I change it back to students, it gives me the array with only Alice inside of it. If I go through here and I change this back to Francisco, now I get Alice and Francisco, both of them placed inside of my database. Now, I don't want this to affect anyone in thinking, oh, well, then what's the point of learning everything that I'm learning because GPT can do it for me. Notice that the only reason why I was able to achieve this kind of prompt is because I myself already know how to code this information, right? Without you having the background knowledge that you already have, being able to generate a prompt that can effectively run a Flash server the way it's running right now, the fact that I already know it needs SQL Alchemy, how to specify databases, what kind of vital information it needs, all of that stuff is what makes us unique as software engineers, is the knowledge itself of how information works and how to break down the requirements of a problem or an application down, right? GPT is a tool for us to perform better or faster, to have GPT do pretty much the busy work for us while we can concentrate in doing the thinking portion of how to solve a problem. Right. So there we see the different types of iterations, which I think was your original question, Tom. My very first iteration was just, hey, create a Flash server. Second iteration, hey, you should probably have a database. Third, I was a little bit more specific as to make sure you have PsychoPG inside of that inside of that URI, because if you don't, it's gonna fail and it's not gonna actually connect to my database. And then finally, I have my server itself running for Flask. Now, additionally, um, this is working for now, but just so everybody knows, which I'm sure we ran into this issue earlier when we were working in Flask, most Mac users, the default port that your Flask application runs in is already being used by your MacBook itself. So if you try to just execute a Flask app, it might cause some problems because it's interacting with a port that's already being utilized. So you have to actually specify a separate port. So there's another thing that we could have added here. We could have said, hey, make sure that it uh, runs on port 8000 rather than running on the default port that's being created by this Flask app. All right. So there's the iteration process. I know I'm a little bit over time. I'm just going to quickly cover something that was brought up earlier regarding security. When we create a .env file, it is important to also create a .getignore file. Now, this .getignore file, what it does is it essentially tells GitHub and Git, which is your internal tool for version control, what files to ignore. In this case, the file that I want to ignore is a .env file. Now, why, you may ask? Well, I don't want any secret keys or environment variables to be tracked by GitHub. Because if they're tracked by GitHub, that means they're exposed inside of my Git history. If I have a public domain or I'm sharing my entire project in public, somebody can go in and just simply look at my commit history or look at everything that I've done in regards to a project and just grab my API key from a previous commit. So in order to make sure that doesn't become exposed, it gets added into a .getignore file stating, hey, please ignore this .env variable. If I run git status, you'll see that it shows me git ignore, app.py, main.py, and prompt.txt. But never once did it show me my .env file. All right, I saw a hand go up.
That was me, but you just answered it right here.
Okay, perfect. All right, quite a bit of information that we covered today over chatbots. Let me do a quick recap. We first went over what is AI. We covered a visual example of what each chatbot is. We have rule-based chatbots, retrieval-based chatbots, and generative chatbots. We talked about how AI affects us today, traditional versus modern day AI. We then went into how to interact with API, with open API programmatically. We learned how to interact with AI, how to learn with AI, and then lastly, precautions. Make sure that if you are actively learning with AI or you're utilizing AI as a way to leverage your learning, you're doing exactly that. Leverage your learning or help you perform better. But if you're using it as I don't know how to do this, let me just ask AI to provide me some code, and you're copying and pasting code that you truly don't understand. For example, if you're looking at this Flash script that it provided you and you don't understand it, you shouldn't copy and paste it. You should have questions like, what does this do? Why is this happening? Why is SQL alchemy important? Um, what does underscore table name do? What happens when this db.create all is executed? All of those things should be questions that you ask this GPT model before you truly execute this and claim this as your code. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that we covered in today's lecture? Let's hear it, Tom.
So if adding the env file to get ignore prevents it from uploading the API key. Say, I created something and wanted to share it with you, and for you to utilize it. If you cloned it, whatever, would that mean that you would need to go grab your own API key in order for it to function? Or, would I need to have some sort of setup directing you to do so, or have some sort of, um, call out to another server to like grab like a hashed version of my API key or something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when it comes to you sharing your personal project with somebody else, standard practice is to have something like .env.ex, and that will show up. Sorry. There you go. And then in here, you would just put something like open API or OpenAI API key and set it to empty quotation marks. This example.env would get pushed up into GitHub, and when somebody else clones it, they would see it. It's also common practice for you to have a README that at some point it states like, hey, API keys, you'll need to utilize this, and then you'll have the key name and then the source for actually grabbing that API key, right? So that would give people the instructions of this is where I go to grab the API key. Once I have it, I could just pull up this example.env file, paste it in there, and then just remove the EX from the front of the file. Does that answer your question, Tom? All right, I see head nods. Any other questions? Okay, fantastic. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.